Good afternoon. I have absolutely no PowerPoint presentation, no videos. On the way here from me and my laptop collapsed, so at the moment I'm working from notes from a pad. So my objective is hopefully not to let you go to sleep, okay? Frankly, I don't pretend to be an expert on entrepreneurship or on conflict. All that I can do is talk about experiences that I've had in Myanmar for the last 8 years. And I would like to put most of the emphasis on this activity essentially on conflict sensitivity, which I think is actually core to an awful lot of the activities. Most people think that Myanmar is a little Asian country popped up by Thailand somewhere. I don't know if you're aware of it or not. It is the same size as France, and it's got a population of 51 million people. It is actually a reasonably substantive country. For the last 5 decades, this country has been subjected to a very controlling, a repressive, insular military dictatorship, and 50 years of civil war. Over the last 2 years, since elections that suddenly took place, led by the old regime, in 2010, 11, we had a new government, and we are moving towards a more open, a more democratic environment. In parallel to that transitional change of the whole of the society, we've got peace negotiations taking place. And to put that in perspective, we have 17 non-state armies in the country. We have negotiated in the last 2 years 15 ceasefire agreements. There are 2 outstanding ceasefire agreements. And at the same time, we're trying to develop an agenda for a nationwide ceasefire agreement, which basically will lay out the political, economic, and social agenda for negotiations for a sustainable peace agreement between one government and 17 non-state ethnic armies, a fairly complex environment. So within the country, we've got 2 activities going on at the same time: a full national transition of the economy, of the political settings, of the society, and peace negotiations. And in central Burma, the area not directly affected by the conflict, we have got people coming out of repression and trying to understand the concepts of democracy. In the ethnic regions around the outside of central Burma, on the borders of India, China, Thailand, etc., we have got communities who have been involved in direct armed conflict for many, many years. The strategies in approaching these differ. However, there are very much some common ground, I think, which we need to take account of in our dealings in fragile environments. The reform process is huge. Most governments will very proudly say, we're currently revising our tax policy, or we're revising our health policy. At the present time in Myanmar, and I'm sure in a lot of other transition and post-conflict states, they are reviewing and revising everything that moves. Everything that moves. It is a huge, huge job. And we still are very, very early days. We've got institutional capacity, and the human development is very, very, very low. The risks are actually very high. But from whatever lens you look at this activity, you do have to actually accept that progress is actually being made. Good progress is being made. What is critical is that the momentum is maintained. This society essentially runs on fear. There is very, very low levels of trust. And as a consequence, very, very low confidence to make any decisions which potentially could put you at risk. There's very little understanding of the new concepts that are being discussed. And that is at all levels of the society. At the government level, we have an interesting phenomenon, which I'm sure others have seen, where the outside world makes demands If you want GSPs reinstated, you need to have a social security policy. Government is very unclear on some of these concepts, but does as is wanted by the outside world. And when they see the consequences of that policy, sometimes they don't like those consequences, so they'd have problems in terms of applying those policies. Generally, there is a lack of conceptual understanding of the concepts, the basics of democracy, the basic fact that when you have a right, you also have a responsibility, is a concept that is simply not understood. The behavioral patterns on how to exercise the issues of new rights that are granted. And it's not helped, of course, by the complete absence of the rule of law, rampant corruption, and the complete failure of the education system. Now, traditionally, the UN, INGOs, and bilateral governments have treated humanitarian activities, human rights activities, and development activities as somewhat linked but separate. They've got different philosophies in terms of the three approaches. If you look at the issue of humanitarian, the philosophy essentially is life preservation, which is critical, of course, but it often is done without addressing the basic rights or the ongoing development needs of the people, and you create a dependency situation, particularly for the most vulnerable in the society. Rights activists have got a tendency to pursue firm principles, which we all agree and believe in. The difficulty is in terms of the accountability processes within the enforcement of principles and the impacts back on certain elements of society. The development community tends to look at positive numbers we're looking for, sometimes with not that much consideration in terms of the targeting of that development activity. And in Myanmar, for example, where you have got a very small elite and a huge population on the poverty line or below poverty, the development policy is currently supporting the elite of the country, essentially. So what I'm getting at is that we need to actually step back a little bit and have a look at the way in which we approach the issues of post-conflict, of fragile states, in the application of our various responsibilities. A more holistic approach is required. Let me give you a bit of an example. Some of you may have heard the problems that are going on in a place called Rakhine State, where you've got problems between the Rakhine ethnic group, who are predominantly Buddhist, and the Rohingya group, who are a Muslim group, a Muslim minority. Okay? Under the old regime, these people cohabitated together. They coexisted. Okay? In fact, they shared the oppression of the old regime. They were subjected to all sorts of abuses together. Right? Since the change, we have actually seen old hatreds evolve, and in the absence of the official formal discipline of the old regime, they have come to the surface. Major civil unrest. As a result, for humanitarian reasons, 130,000 people are now in camps. Right? There are restrictions in their movement. They've got no ability to undertake work. Access to education and health is a problem. They are, however, safe. But the only thing they've got left, actually, is their identity. They no longer have real dignity in way of their life. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that the current government's position is that in order to be able to come out of the camp and develop into a life, you have the situation that they are not permitted to self-identify. If they declare themselves as being Bengali, they will be accepted. If they insist on being Rohingya, which they self-identify, they will not be accepted. So we have the situation where these people have got everything has gone, and the one thing that they retain in self-identity is the one thing that they have to give up in order to get normality. Now, the point that I'm making here is that we have to look at the whole thing in a holistic way. We have to look at the humanitarian, the rights, and the development, because frankly, conflict-sensitive development is probably one of the key tools for resolving this problem. Probably. Not on its own, but it is a necessary ingredient in the package. In the armed conflict environment, we have multiple layers of distrust. And I think it would be useful to look at some of the approaches that we from the outside world may need to be taking in this regard. The critical thing, of course, is to be involved with all of the stakeholders. But external actors have got a tendency of only dealing with the government. And if you think about that from a conflict environment, then you need to be a little bit careful about that relationship. For example, for humanitarian reasons, you may be providing food into the ethnic areas. The government would like that as a quick win for the peace process. The difficulty is that the provision of food without actually the proper contact with the local people as to their needs has the potential to completely decimate what small business activities they have at the moment in food production in those areas. And this is a regular occurrence. The provision of infrastructure. You have the situation where, of course, for the best interest, we would like to introduce communications technology. We would like to introduce new roads. The difficulty is that if you are seen as doing this in partnership with the government, you are seen as being partial to the government, and therefore, potentially, you are my enemy, which again raises issues of conflict sensitivity and the way in which we do our business and the way in which we discuss things. International investors have got a real responsibility, I believe, in doing their due diligence properly. Issues in a conflict environment around land, for example, if you do not do due diligence on the land, there is a very good prospect that you will be driving additional conflict, particularly with people who are more vulnerable than others. Bilateral governments in their relationships tend to be segmented. You have the geopolitical positioning issues, you have the issues of trade competition, and it is absolutely critical that they be balanced against the competition, against the issues of leverage for rights, for social development, and acceptance of sensible international standards application. So what's this all got to do with entrepreneurship, you'll be saying? Well, I believe that actually entrepreneurship is one of the central tools, but we need to take account of all of these aspects in our application. It is clearly one of the tools for supporting people in the reconciliation process. It is creating the peace dividend. Entrepreneurship can be used to break out of that cycle of dependence, and it can be used to break out of the cycle of subsistence living, which a large proportion of these populations experience. Small entrepreneurial activities support the strengthening of governance, often through village committees and things of this nature are able to work through and understanding the principles of democracy because of their entrepreneurial activities that are taking place. I believe they work very hard entrepreneurship also works very well in breaking down the barriers of distrust and potentially for also breaking down the barriers of discrimination, because trade and barter is part of that breaking down of those barriers. The issue for Myanmar is that in order to have sustainable entrepreneurship, there is the critical need for business development services. And there is no business service support sector in the country whatsoever. So small businesses do not have the benefit of support, commercial support, not freebies, but commercial support in areas such as business planning, in terms of their product and their market development, in terms of their access to finance. This is not available. And so one of our priorities to allow entrepreneurship to play its tool as a peace dividend is working in cooperation with Spark in the provision of a solid commercial business service sector to support entrepreneurship in this very fragile environment. Thank you very much.